Now we're going to continue with the reading of the gospel. Rise for that reading. The Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. We hear these words again from the Gospel of Mark. For terror and amazement had seized them. One of the most favorite Good Friday hymns is the hymn, "Were You There?" In fact, we sang that hymn this past Friday as part of our Good Friday celebration. You know how that hymn goes, some of you. "Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?" But this past week I discovered a little different version of the hymn, "Were You There?" It's not found in our own hymnal, but in this particular hymnal, the fourth verse of that hymn reads, "Were you there when God raised him from the tomb?" Now we know that each verse of that hymn includes the following words, "It causes me to tremble." When they crucified my Lord, it causes me to tremble. When they nailed him to his tree, it causes me to tremble. When they laid him in the tomb, it causes me to tremble. But then I was thinking with that last verse in mind that maybe they would use a different word. Maybe they would sing, "Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? It causes me to rise." That's a better Easter word. It causes me to rise. It's the opposite of tremble. But it's interesting, the hymn doesn't change anything. When God raised him from the tomb, it causes me to tremble. I thought, well, that's kind of an odd word to use with a verse that I would associate with Easter. After all, Easter is not about trembling. Easter is about rising up. But perhaps the author of this particular hymn that I found this past week knew very well the ending of Mark, the original ending of the Gospel of Mark, which is what we're using as our Easter story for today. It's a story where the women are filled with what the New Testament Greek describes as trembling and bewilderment. Again, kind of odd words for an Easter story. But they help us to remember that this original Easter event, at least for the gospel writer Mark, did not necessarily create peace and contentment for everybody in the story, but in fact created trembling and bewilderment. If you were to describe in your own words your Easter experience, would you use the words trembling and bewilderment? I know I wouldn't. I know for a fact that when this Easter service concludes, we will be leaving in joy, at least I will be. We're not going to be fleeing in fear like those women at that first Easter. But as I was thinking about that, I also realized that there might be some anxiety in the room here today. Some angst, if you will. That perhaps this is your first Easter without a beloved one. Maybe this is your first Easter without that job that you loved for so long. So maybe for some of us, today is a day mixed with both anxiety and joy. And that's okay. Because there is that tension in Mark's Easter story. And if we're honest, and as we look at our lives and live our lives every day, we know this well. It is a story filled with trembling and bewilderment. This faith story and journey that we're all on together. It's filled with the two words I want to focus on today: awe and amazement. Awe and amazement. Similar to trembling and bewilderment, but our faith journey is a journey filled with awe and amazement. So this is the one thing I hope that you can remember today, is that each day is a step into an unknown. We know this. Each day is a step into an unknown, but an unknown that is already known by God. When we live in this hope, we are filled with both awe and amazement. Every day is a step into an unknown that is already known by God. In our gospel story today from the Gospel of Mark, the women go to the tomb and they are expecting to see what they know. And what they know is death. They don't know resurrection at this point. All they know is that Jesus has died, and their only concern that day is how in the world are they going to roll that tomb away from that stone away from the tomb entrance so they can enter the tomb and purify the body of Jesus. That's what they know. The world that we live in every day is shaped by what we know. And sometimes what we know can be a stumbling block to faith, or what we think we know can be a stumbling block to faith. It's interesting, in the New Testament, the disciples are always misunderstanding Jesus. They just don't get it. Because they lived in a world that was shaped only by what they knew. But eventually the disciples discover that this gospel God, this God revealed in the one named Jesus, will not be contained by the boundaries of what we know. With those boundaries removed, the gospel changes everything in the way that we live in a world that is confined to the boundaries of its own knowing. What we know as endings are suddenly new beginnings. What we know as death is now new life. What we know as failure is now new opportunity. Easter reframes how we know the world and how we know ourselves. The world has been reframed by a tomb that is now empty. And suddenly, the world is very different. That's what happens today. The world becomes different, and maybe that makes us a little afraid. Maybe that's why the women at the tomb are afraid. We now live in a world where endings are beginnings, where death is life, where failure is opportunity. And this difference created by this empty tomb, I hope, will fill you with awe and amazement today and every day of your life. Awe. Awe begins when we understand that our lives rest in the hands of a gracious God. A gracious God who from time to time becomes very frustrated with us as we mistreat God's people and God's creation. Because of this mistreatment, we know that our world is broken. There's the trembling. But Easter tells us that yes, the world is broken, but it is not forsaken. And there's the bewilderment. Our world rests in the hands of a gracious God. And this grace is awesome. It truly is. I am awestruck every day by the reality that indeed the world is broken, but also the promise that it is not forsaken. And that what ultimately lies ahead for this world and for your life is not betrayal, even though it may feel like it, but promise. That what lies ahead for this world and your life is not an ending, even though it may feel like it, but it's a new beginning. That what lies ahead for this world and your life is not death, even though it may feel like it, but new life. That what lies ahead for you in this world is not a failure, even though it may feel like it, but it's really a new opportunity. And all of this is possible because God is an awesome God. A gracious God who loves us in spite of ourselves. So in this Easter season and in the days of your life moving forward, do this for me. Be in awe every day of God's love for you. Don't take it for granted. Be in awe of God's love for you. Last word, amazement. Amazement. You know, not much amazes me anymore at this point in my life, but what does amaze me are sunrises, sunsets, stars in a dark sky, a gentle breeze through the trees. These amaze me because they remind me every day that God, our Creator, is present with us, that God has not abandoned us, but continues to be present with us. And because of that, what really amazes me every day is what God accomplishes through us each and every day. This happens in every congregation I've served. It's happened in this congregation during the interim. I'm always amazed at what God accomplishes through all of us. For instance, you know the women in Mark's gospel reading flee in fear today. But we also know that these women and other women like them will lead the church in great courage. Even as the men hide in fear, the women will invite others, including these men, to come and see what God has done for the world through this one named Jesus. This story of these women leading the church in courage reminds me that every day there are countless stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And sometimes these things are simple and they impact a few. Sometimes they're complex and they impact many. But this Easter season and every day of your life, allow yourself to be not only awed for God's love to you, but allow yourself to be amazed at what God does through people like you. Be in awe of God's love for you and allow yourself to be amazed by what God will do through you. So I want to conclude real quick with those two images I mentioned earlier, sunrises and sunsets. I know some people like sunrises, some people like sunsets, but I think together they capture the tension of this Easter story that we hear from Mark. I like them both. because they remind me that sometimes life feels like a sunrise. And this congregation is going through a sunrise moment in its own history, as this congregation has accepted and will continue to be led by Pastor Kim as your new senior pastor. That's exciting. But life also feels a little bit like a sunset for me, because this will be my last Sunday as I move on to my new gig, as I like to call it. It's not a church word. They don't call it that in the synod office. I think they call it a call, but I like gig. So this is my last Sunday with you, and I'll be moving on to my next interim gig. But always remember that sunrises and sunsets are both beautiful to behold, because we live in a world that knows that the tomb is empty, and that in fact there is beauty to behold in both the sunrises and the sunsets of life. That's the power of the Easter story that we come to celebrate here today. Amen.